This next story is actually fascinating, and I'm not sure that I understand it yet. It's the story of Steve Bannon and Steve Bannon turning on Donald Trump. And the reason I don't understand it yet is because, one, it just came out this morning. Two, Steve Bannon seemed to have Donald Trump's back across the board. And in fact, it seemed as though he was going to use. Now, he did, in fairness, he did give a caveat, a scenario underneath which he would turn on Donald Trump. And I'm trying to recall that at this moment. I can't recall exactly what those conditions were, but I'm sure it's something along the lines of, is the president being true to what got him into the White House in the first place? I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And now there's a book that's coming out called Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House. And Steve Bannon is quoted heavily in this book. And he's speaking specifically of the meeting that happened, I believe, in June at Trump Tower with a Russian lawyer by the name of Veselnitskaya, I believe is her last name. And he described that meeting as treasonous and unpatriotic. And then he went on to say in the book that Don Jr., Natalia Veselnitskaya is actually her full name, that Don Jr. is going to be cracked on live television. So I want to read a paragraph here from theguardian.com, who got access to the book. They said in regard to Steve Bannon is particularly scathing of a June 2016 meeting involving Trump's son, Donald Jr., son-in-law Jared Kushner, and then campaign chairman Paul Manafort, and Russian lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya at Trump Tower in New York. A trusted intermediary had promised documents that would incriminate rival Hillary Clinton. We've covered this pretty extensively. But instead of alerting the FBI to a potential assault on American democracy by a foreign power, Trump Jr. replied in an email, "I love it." Now, this is all known. We cover the email leaks that Don Jr. released his own emails outlining how this meeting came about. He thought it would... Junior, not being the bright one in the bunch, thought that it would exonerate him, but it actually was rather incriminating. So here's a little bit more from The Guardian. They said, quote, "The meeting was revealed by the New York Times in July, blah, blah, blah." Bannon remarked mockingly, "The three senior guys in the campaign thought it was a good idea to meet with a foreign government inside Trump Tower in the conference room on the 25th floor with no lawyers. They didn't have any lawyers." He said, "Even if you thought that this was not treasonous or unpatriotic or bad shit, I happen to think it's all of that. You should have called the FBI immediately." Bannon went on, and this is Bannon speaking to the author of the book, and the author of the book wrote this: "To say that if any such meeting had taken place, it should have been set up at, quote, in a Holiday Inn in Manchester, New Hampshire, with your lawyers who meet with these people. Any information," he said, "could then be dumped down to Breitbart or something like that, or maybe something blah, 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 some other legitimate publication. You never see it. You never know it because you don't need, but that's the brain trust that they had." Whatever he's talking about at the end. This is fascinating, right? So it's fascinating in the sense that besides Fox News, the only media outlet that has, of any significance, right? You have blogs and stuff, but the only media outlet that has been 100% pro-Trump and had his back the entire time has been Breitbart.com. Steve Bannon, of course, is the leader, the editor-in-chief. I don't know his exact title, but he's essentially the leader of Breitbart, and he determines the direction. To see him turn like this, and perhaps he was just running his mouth. He probably was just speaking what he's thought all along. But to say it at this point, at the height of the Mueller investigation, really creates a problem for the Trump administration, to say the least, right? That goes without saying. But the question is now, how does the president respond to this? Because, as we speak, he's probably composing a tweet, getting ready to respond to the allegations from, or the insinuations from Steve Bannon, who was his ace boon coon at one time. I'm still curious as to the why. At first, I thought that this was a book that Steve Bannon was putting out. I'm like, oh, so Steve is trying to make some money. But it's not. It's actually a different author, another author who was just merely interviewing Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon said all of this, which really undercuts the entire, this entire veil of protection that's been around the inner circle of the Trump team and the Trump family and those loyalists who have insisted that they did nothing wrong under any circumstances. There's nothing to see here. There was no collusion. There was no, there was no undermining of the American democracy. We didn't even know the Russians. Something along those lines has been the talking point the entire time. And now someone as close and as intricate as involved in the Trump administration and the Trump campaign as Steve Bannon. I mean, he is like Trump's boy, now turning coat and saying that this is something that he believed was unpatriotic and something that was treasonous. I mean, treasonous. I almost let that slide, right? I almost went right past it and lumped it in with unpatriotic. But to say that it's treasonous falls into the category of high crimes and misdemeanors, which falls into the category of impeachable offenses. Now, the thing is that how much of this can actually be laid at the feet of the president versus how much of this is just going to take down Jared Kushner. Paul Manafort is already under indictment, and what will take down Don Jr., which probably is I think this through, the only person in that group between Kushner and Jr. who would turn on Trump, between Kushner Jr. and Manafort, who would turn on Trump versus fall on their sword for daddy, would be Paul Manafort, who's already under indictment. So this is going to be some fascinating, a fascinating month as we see how the president responds to this. First and foremost, how is the president going to respond to this? And then two, how this actually impacts the national discourse at large. I don't think it's going to impact the investigation at all, because Mueller is probably aware of all this already. But I do think that this is going to put a damper on the conservative. Here's the other thing it's going to do, which I'm not even going to finish the last sentence. The other thing that's going to do is going to fuel the liberal onslaught of Russia paranoia. There's the Russia investigation, which is happening, should happen, and let it run its course. But then you go one step further into the Russia paranoia, and that's going to be a very negative side effect of this information, which the information should enhance the investigation, right? The Mueller investigation. But we all know, I mean, everybody is a Russian spy at this point. Hell, me saying what I just said I'm going to be lumped into Russian spies. Everybody is tied to Russia. If you didn't support Hillary Clinton with your whole heart and mind, you're going to be labeled as a Russian spy. So that is a negative effect of this. And we'll see. As far as the motivations of Steve Bannon, I still have no idea what motivated him. Perhaps, I mean, Steve Bannon is a vindictive, bitter, spiteful curmudgeon. So it could simply be he's waited this long to get back at President Trump for creating or allowing the situation for him to be removed. Everybody says that he resigned. No. Ultimately, he was forced out by the new chief of staff. And so this could be just the long game. He planned on doing this the entire time. If Bannon did think the meeting was treasonous, he sure sat on that feeling for a long time. Maybe Bannon has found a new favorite boy in Paul Ryan for 2020, or perhaps even Pence. This is Valerie in the chat room. I actually like what Valerie said in the chat room, that, perhaps Steve Bannon. See, people actually mistook Steve Bannon for being a genuine alt-right culture war warrior. Ultimately, and the reason I think I agree with the chat room, with Valerie in the chat room, is that I think Steve Bannon is much like any other Republican that you would have countered, which is give us tax breaks. Cut the budget, cut funding for SNAP, cut funding for CHIP, cut funding for everything else so that you could find a way to give us tax breaks. I think ultimately it boils down to that. Steve Bannon, of course, the culture war issues were important to him, blah, blah, blah. But underneath all of that, look at his boy, look at Donald Trump. Underneath all of that, the number one thing that they wanted was to get these tax breaks, and he got that. But it wasn't Trump who gave it to him. Ultimately, it was Paul Ryan who gave it to him. So I think that might actually be a reasonable guess here, and then an informed guess that this simply could be that he sees Trump as a sinking ship, and so he could actually contribute to that ship sinking even quicker and even further. And he still gets what he needs from the Republican establishment. All this talk of being anti-establishment was hilarious to me at best, because they were the establishment. Of course, they beat out Jeb. Of course, they beat out Jeb Bush. They were only anti-establishment during the primaries. As soon as they won, Reince Priebus made sure that the Republican National Committee, the RNC, conformed to the Trump administration, to the Trump team at the time. So this idea that they were anti-establishment, you're only anti-establishment until the point that you get in power. And once Donald Trump won the primaries, he became establishment. And the Republican Party conformed to him. The Republican Party became Trump. And so everything that they talked about, Steve Bannon, who were anti-establishment, we're going to attack, Mitch McConnell, et cetera, that's fine and good. But ultimately, once they got in power, they found that it was useful to utilize them on key issues, namely these tax breaks. So if he could get what he needs for his agenda out of the establishment, which is now conforming to the Trump administration, then of course he has no need to stand by someone that perhaps he has knowledge of, or he believes was treasonous. At least Don Jr. and Vest in the Sky was there. Don Jr., Manafort, and Kushner. That's actually a pretty reasonable estimation there. I think that might be one of the best ways to understand that until we get more information.